Good evening. I see we're all online and we can begin today's discussion. Can the state stand up for our rights, community and subjectivity of citizens within or against the state? This is the second debate preceding the Forum for the Future of Culture, which will be held on March 26 through March 28. Owing to the pandemic, you're all encouraged to follow this online on our website and our Facebook page. This year's forum was organized with the financial support of the European Cultural Foundation and the Batory Foundation, and its motto this year is Solidarity and Care. Once again, we have invited scientists, academics, activists, and artists to discuss ways of creating a new vision of the future. This year, the forum was programmed by 5 curators who are activists and whom I would now like to introduce. We have Zuzanna Karcz. Good evening. Justyna Samolińska. Good evening. Julia Strzemińska. Hello. Amel Mana. Good evening. And Janka Świerżewska. Good evening. My name is Karolina Krapralska, and on behalf of Teatr Powszechny, I'll be moderating today's discussion. We'll be talking about we'll be considering whether within a state, the legal, administrative, and repressive system, we can build community and subjectivity. Can we strive for thorough social change? To what extent does the state give us tools to protect us, and to what extent is it an obstacle in our struggle to gain rights? As previously, I'll ask all our guests to make a brief statement. First, I want to hand it over to Tadeusz Zinowski, who's a squatter, an anarchist, a communist, who's affiliated with the Serena Collective and the Student Anti-Fascist Committee. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Before we answer the question you're asking, I think we should take a look at the concept of rights in the law, because if you look closely, it turns out to be bizarre, based on potentiality. Rights as entitlement are a declaration, a contract. You have the right to something. It doesn't mean the same as you own something. It's a promise, a paper check issued by a sovereign authority. Let's take some simple examples. We all have the right to housing or work, but not everybody has an apartment or a job. We all have the right to demonstrate, and yet most demonstrations last year and earlier were broken up by the police. The ban on abortion is illegal because under human rights conventions it is torture, but it's been enforced for 30 years now. We have a fairly good labor law, but rarely are our workers effectively protected, and bosses and employers break that law. The Declaration of Human Rights and the Constitution give everybody freedom of movement and the selection of a place to live, and yet migrants are locked up in detention centers or drowned into the sea. You can't start a war of aggression. In international law, the sentence for that is death. In Poland, it's life in prison, and yet many governments start wars, and many war criminals are in parliament. And I could give more examples, but I'm sure any of you could find a dozen more of your own, so I won't bore you. It's clear that the scope of real and that the real and not formal scope of the law depends on an arbitrary whim of the law. We spoke of the objective scope of application, but it's similar with the subjective scope, what groups the law applies to. Migration is no exception here. If you look at the history of human rights, it's full of exclusion. At the beginning, revolutionary France promulgated the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and started distinguishing between these two concepts. If you want to be treated like a man, a human being, you have to be a citizen, which is why slavery continued to be practiced in the colonies. Haiti liberated itself, and it took the other colonies half a century. It was similar in the liberal and democratic United States. The Civil War abolished slavery. But there was an exception with the forced labor of prisoners, which explains why the states have the largest prison population. In Nuremberg, Nazi criminals didn't say they were only following orders. They said they were enacting the law, and they were right because Jews were legally stripped of their laws in the Third Reich and rights. This all leads me to conclude that rights on paper are marginal compared to the dynamics of social forces. It's due to this that laws are enacted and sometimes followed. Waving pieces of paper and quoting paragraphs is good propaganda, but it never stopped the police, a bailiff, or an employer from abuse. If the formalist was not backed up by determined people, some so-called illegal demonstrations are not broken up by the police, but they're too strong and militant. Many evictions, legal or not, didn't take place thanks to blockades, but there's no point in distinguishing between legal and illegal strikes because that's contested. It's easier to distinguish between lost and won, those which were successful and those which weren't. Favorable sentences and rulings thanks to the law or good judges, but social pressure. Every political struggle is a trial of strength, which is why we say that rights are gained in struggle. I mentioned Haiti and the slave uprisings, but it's similar with decolonization, workers' rights, women or minorities. Afro-American abolitionists wrote in 1854, the rights of no oppressed people were gained by a voluntary act of justice by the oppressor, and this continues to be true. But once you've won rights, the rights are never there forever because they become an empty concept and will be abolished as shown by the history of the workers' movement in the 20th century. It turns out that we enjoy rights to the extent that we have the strength to oppose the state. At the beginning, I said that the rights are a check, and I believe that that check often bounces. There's only one way to check. Demand are what we've been promised. If we get that, that means we've had the right, and if not, then we didn't. It was only formal. That means that the legality of any struggle is determined post factum, after the fact, and history is the judge. Karol Modzelewski rightly noticed that every criminal code penalizes attempts to overthrow the state, but none for a successful overthrowing of the state. Radical movements see this fact, and that's why our policy is where means lead to ends, understood as material success wins and not changing political representation. Tenants groups block eviction and squat empty apartments because they want housing and not the right to housing. Unions support wildcat strikes and precarious workers because they want to improve the situation of workers. Pro-choice groups help in abortion because they can't wait. They don't want to wait for the right to be abortion to be granted. Queer groups attack homophobic propaganda because they can't wait for legal protection. And anti-fascists block nationalist marches because they don't expect fascism to be delegalized. So is using the language of rights and the law pointless? I wouldn't say that. In many situations, it's a useful way of talking about your demands because the rights we demand are a way of demanding. It's a language that we express our demands in, but it's just a tool. The language of rights and the law is fleshed out in real social struggle. The problem I see, especially on the left, begins when we start confusing useful slogans with what is at stake in the struggle. That's when we fetishize law on paper and see it as a safeguard of our interest. History and experience shows that the law and rights are always empty, and the outcome is always determined by the social balance of forces and not the content of formal regulations. That's why I wanted to open this discussion with this legally nihilistic take on the matter. Thank you. Thank you very much for this very powerful opening statement. And now I want to turn to Professor Beata Kowalska, who is a feminist, a sociologist. She teaches at the Institute of Sociology at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Good evening. Thank you very much for having me. As Karolina said, I'm a sociologist, and in my field there's always been a profound tension between explaining, often granting legitimacy to the status quo, and attempts to look forward to respond to social challenges and problems. That's why today I'd like to adopt this visionary perspective, and it's easier because I'm a feminist sociologist, and therefore I assume that the knowledge we generate is to serve the cause of emancipation, give hope for a more just, equitable social order. A few months ago, in a webinar, Arundhati Roy said that, historically speaking, pandemics had always forced people to break with the past and reinvent their world. And it's no different today. You could say that the pandemic we're experiencing can be a gateway between worlds, or might be such a gateway. We can cross this gateway as Arundhati Roy, dragging behind us dead ideas, or cross it or travel light, ready to imagine a new world. And now let's consider what we want to take with us and what we want to leave behind. First of all, it seems that the present system, based on a connection between territory, state, and nation, is insufficient, and the pandemic has brought this out very clearly. Each of the numerous and painful matters that afflict us today requires solutions that do not fit within the boundaries established by the three concepts of territory, state, and nation. Second, we live in times of changing relations between the state and its residents, citizens. We've been calling attention to this for a long time. Existing institutions that tried to regulate, govern social life no longer respond to the problems of the world today. They lose legitimacy, which is reflected in the belief that basically we have little influence over what is happening in the place we live or the country we live in. We feel that we need a vision that could breathe life into our societies, our communities, which are trapped between the logic of capital and resurgent nationalism. And now getting back to the state, as a feminist, I have ambivalent feelings regarding the state. In theory, the state should, of course, guarantee the rights of every citizen, including women and minorities, whom I treat in political rather than identity terms. So all groups which are pushed outside the social pale owing to their race, gender, class, orientation, and many other factors. In practice, it's different. But every political project people can identify with, or people to identify with a political project, it has to define a concept of a community. At state level, this is usually a nation, which, owing to its patriarchal, colonial, and capitalist roots, is a very problematic, questionable construct. Often, collective identities of a national state are xenophobic and sexist, and to face that, we need to create alternative communities which are strong, inclusive, and will give a sense of safety in uncertain times. This is happening at the moment. For instance, Kurdish women challenged the idea of the state, even though for years they had been fighting for a sovereign state of their own. They believe that what is necessary now is a democratic transformation of society, changing patriarchal culture, because nationalism, of which the state is an emanation, always supports the patriarchy, subordinating women, making them biological or cultural reproductors. On the other hand, we have municipalist platforms with their potential for feminization of politics. By feminization, I mean not only having more women in politics, but a different approach to politics, which involves combining demands for radical change with action that's very specific, that seeks specific outcomes. It is a policy that rejects ideological purity It reflects the diversity of the political landscape locally. It's a self-governing policy based on open, grassroots participatory processes that are relatively horizontal. It is a policy that establishes a creative tension between those who are inside and those who are outside local institutions. I believe that we need a new force, an idea, how to believe once more in democracy as a practice. This can be done only in a grassroots way. To recall the famous the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Anybody who wants to do it differently ends up building a house from the roof down and ends up without a house, without people, without the people necessary to achieve change. So to answer your question, do we need a state and how can we potentially use that state? I'll say is that frankly, I don't have the strength or the hope to get involved, but I am convinced that the grassroots building from the bottom up, asking how can we practice a democratic policy in a grassroots way, that's the main challenge we're facing at the moment. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for this first sociological contribution. And now Professor Anna Zachorowska, an economist who specializes in feminist economics. She teaches at the Institute of Economics, Finance and Management in Krakow. Thank you for having me, and thanks for giving me this opportunity to say a few words. I have to say that for me, the question of the state and agency is very complex. There are a number of elements I wanted to call your attention to. First of all, the state can be seen as a manifestation of community. And what leads me to say this, or I base this statement on the models of social integration developed by Karl Polanyi. Karl Polanyi said that there are three models, three distinct exchange systems: reciprocity, the exchange of gifts. So if we give someone a gift, there is an obligation, and that creates a bond, especially as it is an obligation that's deferred in time. It can be paid forward. Then you have redistribution and the authority or the state, which means that as a community, we conclude that we should in some way share what we produce, what we create in the production process, and then we elect representatives who will redistribute those goods we produce or services among all citizens. The third model is the market, and in the marketplace, these relations are done with the use of money. It's monetary exchange. And Elizabeth Anderson has pointed out that if you look at these three models, only two of them have an element of community. The third does not, because in a marketplace, we do not need to create bonds, relations. It's enough that we have money, we meet, we carry out the exchange, and it's done. Once we've paid for good or service, there's no need to establish a deeper relation. But you will notice that in this vision, the state is a manifestation of community, because as a group, we've come to an agreement, we've elected our representatives and entrusted them to decide for us. Do they decide well? That's a different question, and which I wanted to explore. I want to invoke a theory that was first put forward by Thorstein Veblen at the turn of the century. of the last century. In the mid-20th century, Clarence Ayers wrote that social institutions, including the state, were created to make it easier for us as individuals to act in a group, in society, based on certain traditions and certain earlier circumstances. Above all, these are ceremonial actions that are based on myths and are the way we imagine things. Often, these myths and images are part of the past, and institutions are guardians of those myths. So we can see the state from this perspective. We elect our representatives to decide for us, and the perspective they adopt is not rooted in the present. It doesn't relate to our needs today, because they are guardians of the bygone, and they're trying not to change anything. So where is change possible? Where does change take place? Is it a grassroots process or a top-down process? And in this context, Veblen says that change is the outcome of the clash of two types of actions: ceremonial action, which stem from institutions, and what he calls technological innovation, production, which are grassroots actions that are necessitated by desire for change, for adapting or improving our quality of life. Institutional change is the product of a clash is what happens when these two worlds clash. We have a dichotomy of ceremony and production, and only once they've clashed, the true institutional change is possible. If we take a look at what's happening in Poland today, we can conclude that we see that this is truly the case. Rights have been taken away from us. A few months ago, there was a very fundamental change. Why did that change happen? Because the state concluded that it is the guardian of a certain tradition. What's interesting is that it's the tradition of a privileged group. It's not the tradition of everybody who makes up that state, but that's how this action was explained, was justified. On the other hand, there is a grassroots change taking place, but unfortunately I can't say that the grassroots protests we've had over the last few months have changed something, because we need to wait. We need to wait for that to happen. Another change is giving women greater subjectivity, empowering women, and the state as an institution which creates the law, no matter how empty that law is, had to respond and had to adapt certain modes of behavior to what truly happened. So women are subjects of the Constitution, or now the labor law. That's a response to real events in society. So this productive action affected ceremonial action to the extent that a law was adopted theoretically to protect us. But does it? Well, I think the answer to that was already given in the first statement. Thank you very much. Thank you for this contribution, and now I'd like to ask Jakub Grzegorczyk, who is an activist, and he's with the Polish Workers' Initiative Trade Union. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Much like the previous speakers, I believe that the structures of the state cannot be treated as a subject, as an entity that will grant us rights or that will enforce our rights. The state, understood very broadly as state authorities, the parliamentary system, the judiciary, and the administration, is not an external, objective arbitrator that will be involved in social relations, for instance, labor relations, because that's what I'll be talking about, and protects the vulnerable. This is an approach that we often see among people with left-wing or social democratic beliefs, persons who are sensitive to the vulnerable, and the state is seen as an arbitrator who steps in and changes unjust relations between employees and employers and orders that, protecting and defending the weaker party, namely the worker. Such a vision of the state is ahistorical, as you've said already, but it's also naive and impractical. And to give another example from history, we have to say that the modern present states did not develop in a vacuum. These structures developed side by side alongside a capitalist economy and capitalist labor relations, and provided support for those labor relations they guaranteed, or were often a bulwark, the foundation for those relations. If we take a look at the evolution of state structures, then in terms of labor relations, their purpose was to protect the interests of capital rather than the interests of working people. But moving away from bygone history, we have to something that Tadeusz Zinowski mentioned, namely about the origins of progressive elements of the law, for instance, labor law. I don't think you can identify any element of relevant change in labor law that hadn't been fought for or won in a process of struggle. The 8-hour working day, or the right to unionize, a minimum wage, prohibition of child labor, fundamental workers' rights. In each of these were preceded by a long struggle, often brutal, struggle by organized labor. So, regulating any part of labor relations is usually the outcome of a very long process of social struggle. I think that's often forgotten in the Polish trade union movement, also in the Polish left wing, where we look at certain solutions that were welfare state solutions developed in Western Europe, Germany, Sweden, France, and we assume that they had been granted by the state, which stepped in to intervene and correct, revise labor relations. But even if we take a country like Germany, which is known for its developed system of social dialogue and the moderate position of trade unions, the famous cutting working time down to 30 hours a week in German industry in the Western Länder. This was the result of collective bargaining signed by the trade unions and employers, but this collective bargaining was preceded by a long-term strike campaign, many strikes. And that's the first historical and general comment I wanted to make. It seems to me that assuming that state intervention is external, sovereign, and impartial is naive due to the belief that if the state enacts a principle, for instance, in labor relations, that is a fully effective intervention. Of course, from the standpoint of trade union practice, we see at every step that this is not the case. Exploitation in labor relations is dynamic. It's a process of permanent conflict. Regardless of whether we believe in class struggle or not, the fact is that working hours, wages, and occupational health and safety is always the subject of a conflict between the world of labor and the world of capital. This conflict sometimes leads to legal regulations, deregulation, liberalization, or flexibility, where capital has the upper hand, or a tendency to regulating, reducing working hours, or raising the minimum wage when the bargaining power of working people is greater. The relations between capital and workers have not been established once and for all. The conflict is not abolished by state regulations. Both parties keep looking for opportunities to circumvent the regulations, to change them, or to modify them for their own benefit. This is clear when we look at minimum wages for contracts, for short-term contracts. Formally, this is something that was introduced by the current Law and Justice government, but the fact is that it was preceded by mobilization by unions in the retail, restaurant, or construction sector. Second, the introduction of these wages was followed by new ways of circumventing the regulations. For instance, not paying all the wages, combined employment, mixed employment, where you formally employ someone for the minimum wage, but you don't pay overtime, or you collect, for instance, a deduction for uniforms, etc. Briefly speaking, relations of exploitation, labor relations, are mutable, change, and if we want to change them, then we have to organize at grassroots level. We have to support those in whose interest we're fighting, and not look at the state to be an outside umpire, arbitrator who will come and save us, because the only way of helping workers is when they help themselves. Thank you. Thank you very much. And changing our perspective, I'd like to ask Dr. Michał Pospiszil, who is a philosopher, a historian of ideas, and a lecturer at the Institute of Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Science. Thank you very much. I begin by saying that regardless of how we try to answer the question, it would be worth removing the state-centered perspective it contains, it implies, even though theoretically it proposes a discussion whether we should be against the state or within the state, but the subtitle contains a category that refers to citizens and is drawn from the same vocabulary, a legalistic state vocabulary, which is very problematic. If we look at it more closely, it's enough to take a look at Hannah Arendt's classic text from 1943, where she describes Mr. Cohn, who wanted to be a German, then a Viennese, and then a French, but never succeeded because owing to the fact that he was Jewish, the state never accepted his aspiration to become a full-fledged citizen. Agamben supplements this text by providing another circumstance, namely the fragility of the category of citizenship, which came to light in the early 20th century, when various states stripped or denied citizenship to various social and ethnic groups considered to be hostile. In France, this took place in 1915. Then we had Belgium, Italy, Germany, and Austria. So looking at the question from a perspective where we realize how deeply entrenched we are in this state legalist language seems fundamental, regardless of whether we try and answer the question from an anarchist or a more statist perspective. A method that was very popular in the 20th century, in the 20th century humanities, which I think is very useful here and adequate, is Michel Foucault's genealogies. That's based on two very simple principles. On the one hand, it's about showing the historical sources of a given category, which we consider obvious and eternal, as if it were served universal and interests. So on the other hand, on the one hand, you have the sources of the origins of a category, and on the other hand, we look at the history of that category, the processes and antagonisms that accompanied it. And one such category that had an important role in the way that contributed to the way we think about the relationship of rights and society is the concept of rule of law. It seems something obvious. It's something we take for granted. We want the rule of law, but when we take a closer look at the category, if we look at the period where it emerged, late 16th, early 17th century in England, it was used to uphold specific interests or struggles, and the category of citizenship the same goes for citizenship. Most of these categories, like most categories such as rule of law, rely or are based on a very linear, very superficial understanding of history, which is a story of progress, where good supplants evil, where the arbitrary or feudal authority, or in 16th and 17th century Europe, it was the conflict between absolute monarchy and the nascent bourgeoisie. So this is a story about the freedom fighters and establishing clear, transparent rules governing social life, and everybody should subscribe to that. But if we take a closer look, if we look at the social and economic ramifications, then it turns out that the picture is far more complicated, and the term rule of law was often used to implement policies that are completely inconsistent with what we consider to be rule of law. In 17th century England, it was used to expropriate smallholders. Then it legitimized expropriation of Indians and the colonization of America, the Americas. And this legitimacy was provided by major philosophers of liberalism. But it's enough to take a look at the numbers. what we consider a breakthrough, a turning point in the modern Western world. So the period between 1700 and 1850, the number of slaves grew from 300,000 to 3 million. When all these rights are being put into effect, when bourgeois modern liberal revolutions are taking place, the outcome for a very large, numerous group is the opposite of what a linear, superficial version of history as progress would have us believe. But it seems that this genealogical approach to the transparent, state-centered categories can also be applied to the way they exist today, the way they are applied in the policies of the International Monetary Fund, cohesion policies in the countries of the global south, which are required to introduce a rule of law, the purpose of which is so that capital can freely invest and expropriate small farmers, to take away the land of small farmers. I think that I could probably end there, but this genealogical work, it's a question of making the categories we use historical and looking at them from a historical perspective and not as universal and self-evident. So that should be the starting point for any discussion of whether we position ourselves against the state or within the state. Thank you, and thank you for this perspective. And now, Klaudia Borkowska, who is a law student and activist working with the Polish Society for Anti-Discrimination Law. Thank you for having me. Good evening. The starting point for my contribution will be human rights. I am a student. I study law. Human rights are addressed to the state. Between individuals, it's mainly Article 17 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which introduces a prohibition of the abuse of rights. The foundations of this principle were established by Alexis de Tocqueville in the 19th century when he said that the freedom of one individual ends where the freedom of another person begins. So people are not bound to respect human rights with respect to the state, but the state is obliged to respect human rights and intervene when these rights are violated. So the state has the duty to enable those rights which are directed against the institution of these states. We can claim these rights by freedom of association, civic legislation, or public information, freedom of information. So the foundation of democracy is the participation of citizens in power and controlling power, checks and balances. To control the authorities, the power, we have a number of methods. I don't find them entirely effective. For instance, civic bills are often placed in the freezer. We don't know for how long and when they'll be taken out. We've often read about Article 7 procedure of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which turned out to be so protracted that it wasn't threatening or in any, from our perspective. We have the Court of Justice of the European Union, whose rulings we obliged to enact, but after the last ruling, the Justice Minister said that the ruling was unacceptable, and the Prime Minister moved to examine the collision and inconsistency between European Union law and Polish law by the Constitutional Court in Poland. We also have the European Court of Human Rights, but its rulings usually grant compensation, and its judgments often grant compensation and do not often lead to changing the law. And at one point, so we come to a point where as citizens, we are powerless and defenseless, and the only resort is civil disobedience. This is a concept that doesn't exist in Polish law, but it's defined by doctrine as intentional breaking the law. following the convictions, and that regulations are in contrast with the values of the person who practices civil disobedience. The doctrine also according to the doctrine, civil disobedience is used when all other forms of protest turn out to be ineffective and the injustice is grave and obvious. So we've also, and I agree with this, some people say that civil disobedience is a way of testing the law. It discovers the defects of our system and leads to fixing these defects. So civil disobedience is not meant to harm the system, but rather improve it. And I want to give an example, which I know personally. As a student, the logging in the Białowieża forest, when activists, after ineffective protests, entered a fenced-in area, which with signs saying "no entry," and chained themselves to trees. The state sought to punish these activists, but they were acquitted in court. And the opinion accompanying the acquittal was that they were acting in higher necessity. So we see here that the state has to give us the right to due process, the right to a court. Thinking about the concept of civil disobedience, I wonder where's the boundary of civil disobedience? At which point civil disobedience turns from blocking the street or chaining yourself to trees until it leads to a social rebellion, which will lead to greater polarization and possibly aggression so antagonizing people against the state or people against other people. I wonder whether violations of the law in a situation when we live in a system of oppression and demanding our rights is ineffective, can this be a way of claiming human rights? And here I want to quote Professor Łętowska, who said that the motive of civil disobedience should be to demonstrate the unconstitutional nature of a practice or statute which is secondary to the Constitution. So civil disobedience would, according to Professor Barbara Stoczewska, be a way of upholding the Constitution. I think that in Poland, the system of civil rights is ineffective. I see the need to increase the participation of citizens, to have greater participation of citizens in power and controlling power, with a view to, for instance, changing the education system, speaking about a greater civic participation in power and controlling authority, government. I'm thinking about changing the constitution we have at the moment, because the one we have is a little inadequate, it's imperfect, and when I think about a constitution, I would like to have a constitution that guards the foundations of a rule of law, that precludes fiddling with the law and predicts various events. For instance, the term of the ombudsman comes to an end. The parliament can't appoint a new one or elect a new one, and the Constitutional Court has been putting off a hearing in this case for months. I see a constitution that would also make it impossible to keep these civic legal initiatives in the freezer. I would even say that we need a constitution that enables citizens to enforce the law. This might be a little populist, but I'm thinking of making it possible for citizens to apply to the European Court of Justice, or we can have a public accountability ombudsman who would be elected with the votes of citizens, perhaps exclusively. And the tribunal of the state also needs to be reformed. In closing, I'm asking myself, will radical rebellion help us? As a legalist, however, I would be in favor of struggle within the legal system. I don't think that civic action can only be topical and emotional. I see the need for long-term action, systemic action that it tries to change the foundation, the way Poles are educated about their rights and the way the system works. But frankly, given the circumstances, it's hard for me to hope to believe that change can be achieved this way. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Thank you for this first legal perspective today. And now I want to turn to Sebastian Słowinski, who is an activist, anti-fascist, and a commentator, columnist with the Student Anti-Fascist Committee.
Hej, dzięki.
Thanks. Maybe I'll comment on what the previous speaker said in the interest of continuity. So before I try to answer the question, do we act against the state or within the boundary of the state? Let me just say that I also feel the need for action that wouldn't be topical, that wouldn't just be a reaction, a response, reactive. So I think that political action must be systemic, but we need to ask what kind of system we mean, the system we have now, or and systemic action contribute to creating a new system, and if so, how? So leaving the question off to one side, I would rather tend to opt for in spite of the state. What I mean is you don't need radically to oppose the state or give the state legitimacy by submitting civic legislation or getting involved in state institutions and so on, although that's important because it would be cynical to turn your back on the state and on individuals or groups who are fighting for their rights. So political struggle in spite of the state wouldn't mean, again, giving up the struggle for recognition in the law, because it's not that the law is necessary, but it's highly ambivalent. And given the nature of the law, the way the law is put to use in the political and social space, I see a point. I think it's not only because it's something I do myself, because that it would be hypocritical of me to say otherwise, but fighting for recognition within the law, but this struggle shouldn't take up should take up less than half our strength. We need something more or something else. For months, or actually for a much longer time, we've witnessed and participated in a process of developing new forms of subjectivity that aren't necessarily civic. And we've also witnessed new demands that are not claiming rights we have that we're entitled to. But these demands and new forms of subjectivity are put into practice, are affected in different places and in on different principles. This would be like creating a new society in the shards of the old one. And that's something I can relate to because it doesn't cynically ignore topical needs that need to be answered using legal instruments, but on the other hand, it's not involved in that struggle so deeply as to forget or neglect the creative aspect of politics and not be brought down to just dry speeches in parliament. One of the previous speakers said that this is about democracy that can be built bottom up, from the bottom up, but perhaps it's not about democracy, but about autonomy that could allow us to articulate a new language where we wouldn't wonder what rights we want, but instead how to articulate our demands, and can these demands be fulfilled beyond or outside the scope of the law? Can we build a community within the framework of the state? We can, but what for? Sometimes it's worth it because it's necessary to have a sense of security. But I think that the point of politics, action, and striving for change is to embody and put it into effect. And it can be put into effect without looking at the state, at least to some extent.
Bardzo dziękuję, Sebastian.
Thank you, Sebastian. Now, let's have Katarzyna Czarnota, who is a sociologist, an activist, and a PhD candidate at the Department of Sociology at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. Thank you very much. I regret that we can't respond to what's been said already. However, I would like to briefly comment on the issue of intervention. It's not the case. It's not that the systemic change wasn't accomplished by overthrowing, or hasn't. Systemic change was accomplished by overthrowing systems, political systems, or previous laws. I'll give an example that might perhaps better illustrate the mechanisms that I wanted to present. I think that the neoliberal national state represents the interest of specific groups and social classes. These are privileged classes that usually have power, and they have the power to exclude others from participation and distribution, but a way of channeling social discontent when the neoliberal state no longer acts in the interest of citizens are NGOs that fight for human rights, at least in theory, or civil rights. This category of citizenship is also very differentiated, and it also has to do with the national state, but also a safety valve, NGOs, and it also depends on how we understand political citizenship and rights, not in theory, but as a possibility of fulfilling and satisfying one's own needs. Let me give an example that illustrated that was typical of a moment when the state stopped working and when the law was suspended. And I'm referring to 2012, the beginnings of the tenant defense movement in Poznań. The tenants of a building at Stolarska Street, the tenants and residents saw that the state wasn't doing anything to guarantee their rights. And the state also didn't suffer any consequences for this. So the rights were legally suspended in a way, and the state was violating the law that it itself was meant to follow. So theoretically, we know that legally eviction is prohibited and shouldn't take place. But what changes the situation? This blockade of Stolarska Street was a breakthrough because it led up to a solidarity movement that was involved different classes. The people living in this building were represented various social groups. These were people waiting for alternative housing, or teachers, academics, university teachers and lecturers. So they understood that anybody can be affected by eviction. And after months and years, this accomplished a change in the law, the stigmatization of illegal eviction, or enforcing evictions, not because there were conflicts with the landlord, but showing a broader context of the new market of enforcers, of people cleaning out residents and emptying buildings, because these were rights that were won in a struggle. Practice showed that it won't be respected or guaranteed by the state without constant social pressure, constant pressure on the part of tenants' defense movements. And the positive outcome, social movements, grassroots movements, can achieve much more than NGOs, because NGOs, by definition, they do not challenge the oppression of the system, a system built on oppression and subjection, subordination. We see this, for instance, having taken part in demonstrations recently. Specific groups are excluded and cannot satisfy their needs, or cannot enjoy political citizenship in a broader sense. So getting back to the question, I think that the main mistake often made is blind faith in the law. Or we have a piece of legislation, and that'll allow us to realize our needs. That's not the way it works. These interests work differently and are constructed differently, and it's a matter that I think requires constant discussion. I'm happy that this discussion is taking place and is gaining traction, because a few years ago, when the system of state oppression, rule of law, and a law that doesn't work when laws and rights are suspended, we felt this. We felt the impact of this, but now this discussion is no longer marginal, and it's reaching more groups. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for mentioning tenants' rights. Now I want to hand it over to Professor Monika Płatek, who's a lawyer, a feminist. She's the head of the Department of Criminology at the Institute of Criminal Law of Warsaw University. Thank you for having me. You've asked us, can the state represent our rights? I wonder what you mean when you say the state. Who is the state? If we were in state, Louis XIV would say, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state, and we'd tell him, "Buzz off, l'état c'est nous," we are the state. So when we say the state, we usually mean the government. And we're speaking from our own perspective, a Polish perspective, where most of us ended up by chance, and by chance we found ourselves affected by concepts like patriotism, memory, mindset, and the link between church and state. If we asked Norwegians the same questions, then despite Breivik, they'd say that the state is a community. They have a history of community going back to the 11th century. If we were to ask Americans, who are very similar to us, then, this Trump notwithstanding, they'd say that the state is we, the people. So It's a very important community, and that's something you can fall back on. I said we are similar to Americans, and I stand by that in terms of the system of value, thinking, behavior, and the history of slavery that we had in both countries. But where we differ is the 230 years of democracy in America and a situation where we never had 20 years of democracy in Poland. Our roots, the roots of our democracy are thin, fragile, frail, short, and they're often destroyed. And that that affects the way we think and speak. We are in a situation where we have a government that's terribly immature, that's uneducated, that looks after its own interest, regardless of whether it's the people who are in power or the opposition. When the opposition says that we have to vote for what the Law and Justice Party wants because they'll do what they want anyway, shows that it's a question of a particular interest. Government that would be in line with human rights. I think it's time we realized that the French Revolution of 1789, with its slogan of liberty, equality, and brotherhood, and there was no mention of sisterhood, was never intended to be exclusive. Human rights are not exclusive. Liberté, the concept of liberty, meant political rights, nothing about us without us, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of choice. Of course, Olympia de Gouges, who said that if women can be executed by the guillotine, let us speak in parliament. She ended up executed and guillotined. So the idea to say that those who come to power, those who they can rule, but they are limited by the Constitution, so they can enjoy their rights, but the Constitution contains a human rights element which says that even a short and unthreatening ruler has a sword, but human rights are a shield with lots of exceptions. In political rights, the only exceptions, we cannot introduce a law that allows torture and slavery. At the same time, in Poland as well, we had slavery and torture. But the essence, the idea is that it cannot be legally enacted. The second concept of égalité, 100 years later, meant that we put everything in one bag and we expect the government to distribute that fairly. The right to housing, leisure, work, and health doesn't mean, and I'm addressing Tadeusz Zinowski, doesn't mean that you're born and you have the right to a flat. No, that's not the way it works. We have the right to demand that the government spend our money and manage our money in such a way as to guarantee this for as many people as possible. And we needed the 21st century, that fraternité without sororité, without sisterhood, showed us that human rights, namely requiring governments to notice that there are children in the world. If some idiot in Moscow presses a red button and another one presses the button in Washington, then there'll be nothing to talk about because we'll be ash. No war is not a motto, is not the slogan of and non-discrimination is not the slogan of crazy feminists. We have the right to require governments to govern in a way that's limited. So demanding human rights is important, and human rights also refers to what we had 20 and 30 years ago, the discriminating against the LGBT community, against women, people with disabilities, children, the elderly, animals, a whole group of people who were treated badly, but we needed the transition in Poland after 1989 for us to notice it here and for us to demand freedom. It's a process. It won't be an easy process. Two more comments. I'm running out of time. Challenging, undermining human rights goes hand in hand with demands by Ordo Iuris and the extreme right who say equality. No, we're not equal, and we won't have anything about equal rights. It's about the government, the authorities, ruling in a way that doesn't violate human rights. And it's not about the right to abortion. Let's not talk about abortion. Let's talk about reproductive rights. Reproductive rights are a human right, and that's revolutionary. This revolution is taking place. And noticing that we are looking at a revolution organized by young people who are aware and who disagree. This will lead to resistance by the authorities who unrightfully, unlawfully will seek to destroy the rights. It's a government that's greedy, that's uneducated, and who doesn't care about us, even if left-wing and right-wing. The one thing I would point out is what Zinoviev said, namely that if you dismantle a shack, you can build another shack, but it will be very similar to the old one. And our hope is that what gives us hope is that we've given a name, we've named things, we've pointed out, and we demand recognition and equality for groups that had not been noticed previously. The fact that this has not yet been achieved doesn't mean that we can question human rights, namely the obligation to govern in such a way as not to violate human rights. Thank you very much, Professor, for your contribution. Before I hand it over to our curators, I'd like to ask Dr. Elżbieta Korolczuk, who is a feminist, a sociologist, teaches at the Center of American Studies at Warsaw University. Thank you very much for having me. And I think I'm interested in debate and polemics more than I am in making statements. So I want to refer to what's been said already and ask a couple of questions. Again, to follow up on what Monika Płatek said, I'd like us to consider whether we're talking about the state or talking about authorities, because the theories of authority, there are different theories, and any theory which assumes that the state is monolithic has more to do with the way we imagine power than with the way the state operates. When I'm thinking about the way this discussion is going, I find it very interesting that it's a very static vision. So we assume that there is a monolithic leviathan, the state, a state that we have to resist, a state we need to pressure in order to claim our rights, in order to get what we require, and in order to protect people from suffering. But from a sociological and empirical perspective, we know that the state is rarely a monolith. It doesn't operate the same in every area. The same goes for liberalism. Some minorities are given an opportunity, while the majority is deprived of that opportunity. But it's never homogeneous. It's never the same. We enter into a relation with groups, with other people, and depending on how we imagine, perceive the government, the authorities. For instance, Charles Wright Mills, who said that there's an elite of power, And you also said that there's an elite, people who have the power, economic, political, cultural, and all we can do is to challenge, to try and undermine the position of the elites, which usually means that by burying another elite, we start creating another. And that's a process we're seeing in Poland today. The government, which says that it opposes the elites, opposes the pluralism of elites while constructing its own loyal elite. Like Robert Dahl, we have a polyarchy where the power is distributed, not concentrated. It operates in various contexts, it's relational, and it's subject to negotiation and contestation at various levels. And when I look at this from the standpoint of what we know about social movements, it is a vision where you have people going out into the street in an act of resistance, an act of rebellion, disagreement, and the state gives in to this resistance. The state knuckles under. The state says, okay, as the Leviathan, I will step back and step down. And that's what happened in 2016. There was a draft. It was a civic draft, but it was supported by the government to introduce a total ban on abortion and to have a 5-year prison sentence for any women who would have an abortion. This draft, this initiative was discussed in Parliament, and then people, mainly women, went out into the street and said no. The government stepped down, and we felt that we managed to overcome the monopoly of power, but the process is far from over, nor are the people who made demands of the government is monolithic. These people are also a very deeply religious people who say that as citizens we demand a total ban on abortion, and that would be a true manifestation of equality in the face of the law and in the face of the state. That's true protection of human rights, defense of human rights, because fetuses, not women, are people in their view. Treating the state as a monolith and treating the people, citizens, as a monolithic group really leads nowhere. It's not borne out in experience. It's not substantiated. It's not a conflict that can be addressed or resolved in a simple way by saying we are speaking truth to power, and power will give in and step down. I'm thinking about two very interesting books that show the relationship of feminism, the women's movement, and the state. The first is Leanne Banashak's The Movement Inside and Outside the State, which describes what happened in the 60s and 70s. It's a story that we know. Our image is that we have women mobilizing. There was the civil rights movement, we had the sexual minorities movement, and we had anti-war movements. So this momentum of human anger led to fundamental institutional and discursive or cultural change. But Leanne Banashak says yes and no, showing that within the state there were people whose support and willingness to cooperate were crucial for this change to happen, were a crucial factor. The second book, which is more critical of the state, is Marta Rawłuszko's Feminists Cooperating with the State, which shows gender mainstreaming, a term that a lot of people don't like, but we can we can think to what extent and in what areas gender mainstreaming was in line with women's needs or where it was off the mark, and to what extent was it an instrument of neoliberalism. Both books show the battlefield is not homogeneous, that it's diverse. The state is not monolithic, and neither is society. It's not as homogeneous as we'd like. And moreover, the relationship between the two changes in the wake of institutionalizing social movements. Referring to what was said previously, what happens when representatives of a social movement are elected as who is Ivona Hartwig? Is she still an activist working for people with disabilities? Is she an outsider? Is she an advocate, a champion, or does she represent the state? Or perhaps there's something in between. Can you partly become part of these structures without becoming a cog in the monolithic leviathan, and act from the outside? And in closing, I want to get back to what Monika Płatek said about the processes we have, ultra-conservative, fundamentalist organizations appropriating, co-opting human rights vocabulary. They do that by changing the referent. They say that human rights ought to apply, but it's fetuses who are the human being. Minority rights are an important element of our legal system, but the minority are embryos that might have severe birth defects, and so that's a minority of people with disabilities. So does that mean that the whole idea of human rights and the concept of citizenship was doomed to this appropriation? Perhaps. But in the same way, these movements are also co-opting, appropriating anti-colonial vocabulary. So does anti-colonialism or post-colonial theory contain elements that make it possible for them to be taken over by their opponents? Or perhaps it's a negotiation, it's a process that will continue. So it depends on how we flesh out these concepts, and that will determine who they apply to, what rights will be negotiated, which groups will be protected by the state. And as I said, I don't really have an answer to all the questions, but I think these are questions worth asking. And we should think about power the way Hannah Pitkin saw it. There's a power over someone, others, but there's also a power to act. Do we always need to think about the state as an institution that has power over someone, or perhaps there's a type of power that state that has the power to change social circumstances? Thank you for this contribution. Thank you for mentioning the theory of elites. Now, I want to hand it over to our curators. Justyna Samolinska is an activist with the Workers' Initiative trade union, which has quite a few representatives today. Thank you and good evening. I feel that a lot of what I wanted to say has already been said, especially by Tadeusz Zinowski and Jakub Grzegorczyk from the Workers' Initiative Union. But what I am missing in what they said, namely that rights are something that you have to fight for, you have to win in a process of struggle. If we don't if we don't add solidarity and care, then we end up with a weird form of social Darwinism. That is, rights will only be enjoyed by those people who can fight for them, who can stand up for themselves. but that excludes a lot of groups, starting with children, persons with disabilities, the persons who care for them, everyone who doesn't have the instruments to fight for their rights and stand up for their dignity. So when thinking about self-organization and standing up for one's interests in a capitalist society and in a state, in the state that perpetuates the capitalist system, you can't have capitalism without a state. It's the state that creates the market. After 30 years of neoliberalism in Poland, we've grown used to this, that this opposition of capitalism and state, but the one generates the other. You can't have capitalism without the law, without law enforcement, without the entire system created by the state. And in a capitalist system, there are groups who will not be able to stand up for themselves. And the question is, can we conceive of another system in which the rights of the vulnerable would be guaranteed without the state? I doubt it. I doubt it whether an anarchist vision in which we win rights and those who fight for their rights as employees or tenants, and there's more of us than there are employers and landlords. But I think that such a vision is unfeasible, really, when we look at the practice of a state like Poland, which horribly neglects the rights of the vulnerable and erodes those rights. If people have rights and if they have a chance to live with dignity, that's thanks to state protection and the law. Like Elżbieta Korolczuk, I don't feel I have all the answers. I'd prefer to ask questions and point out that when we're thinking about struggle, we should also think of care and think whether everybody's able to fight and who can fight for the most vulnerable. Okay, that was brief, but like I said, most of what I wanted to say has already been said. Thank you, Justyna. Now, Zuzanna Karcz, who is an activist for human rights, the new wave of activism. Thank you for having me, for inviting me to this second debate. I would like to get back to the school system and to young people, because I think that the concept of the state begins in school. That's that's our first encounter with the state as a definition and an institution that can be somehow described. This micro-state, the school, because it is in school that we first encounter the law. Of course, it's the regulations of a school, but it's still the law, which very rarely makes room for any initiative or subjectivity of students. Instead, it restricts that initiative and subjectivity. I don't want to say that you can do without the state entirely altogether, because as people, we tend to self-organize, and this need to create standards is something that exists independently of us. If we, for instance, agreed that we have no state, these standards will develop at some point, emerge at some point. So if we consider people will always create an inner structure. So if a group is excluded from citizenship, that group will always develop structures of its own somehow. And the concept, the idea of statehood began long ago, but we began speaking about states in the 19th century, the first constitutions in the 18th century, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and that's when this Prussian model of the school system emerged, one which still exists today. It's a school which doesn't teach teamwork. It's not something, teamwork is not something you see in study groups, is not something you have in Polish schools. And instead, we learn, it's a compromise that we see in Polish law. The Polish constitution is also the outcome of compromise, which is often mentioned in the context of reproductive rights. But the effects of this act, this law, are also visible in school, and that's why we're opposing attempts to impose certain values in school by the state, when the state tries to impose certain values. That's why it's so important to understand and empower young people so that they can shape the school they study in as students, as alumni. We tend to forget, because we've learned that the state, the micro-state we encountered in the school, is something we can't do anything about. Schools are very formalized. They are controlled by the state, and graduating high school, we tend to forget that it's a vision of statehood of the state that's been inculcated, that we learned at an early age. I personally believe that the system can be changed. You can act in a systematic way. You can practice advocacy. The problem is that these preconceptions about the division of roles and functions, and that the static nature of authority is something that we've been taught in school. It's changing, however, but we were learned that you can't challenge the authority of your teacher. But when you look at the protests, when you look at what's happening in the streets and online, young people see an option to build their subjectivity, to claim their subjectivity. There's a chance that that Polish schools will change, because our rights, and we have rights as human rights, and we see that that schools don't correspond to our needs, aren't compatible with our needs as students. That's why I believe. That's why I believe that we will be free to teach, study, and understand the world, and that'll allow us to change other areas of social life, because everything begins in. Thank you, Zuzanna. Now I want to ask Julia Strzemińska. Apart from being a curator of this year's Forum for the Future of Culture, Julia is a feminist and anti-fascist with the Syrena Collective. I have a lot of doubts related to the question in the title. I have similar doubts. My doubts are similar to those expressed by Justyna, but what I want to say will be more in line with what Michał Pospiszil. What I have to say is very simple, and Zuzanna also, to follow up on what Zuzanna said, I think that our first encounter with the state is actually in preschool, in daycare. What I wanted to say is that the law is not transparent, nor is it ahistorical, and it has not been given by God, laid down by God. The law is written by people, a handful of people, citizens, and the law also creates an image of citizens and non-citizens alike. So for a long time, women were non-citizens. Today, undocumented migrants are non-citizens. To legitimizing an attitude, a position also involves criminalizing other aspects. And here, let me quote Karolina Więckiewicz from the Abortion Dream Team, who said that every abortion law is in fact anti-abortion because it contains a list of obstacles and barriers preventing you from having an abortion, and also determines when we can be denied an abortion. It's a lot of power over our bodies. So the process of establishing the subject of the law also involves exclusion and criminalization of others. By calling one thing work, we refuse to recognize that another form of activity is work. This applies to care work done by women, as described in Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. She writes about how women's subjectivity is based on reproduction, while women are denied the right to control reproduction. She writes how the state takes over control over fertility and takes their agency away by requiring abstinence and imposing a morality based on abstinence. This leads me to conclude that the law is not always determined in line with the interest of the group it applies to, and often it serves to subordinate that group. This was the case with the Act of 1993, the so-called Abortion Compromise, which was adopted despite the opposition objections of women, and the parliament also ignored the 2 million signatures under a civic draft that would liberalize abortion law. Despite all this, abortion is still done. What was criminalized in the 1993 law was poverty. Access to abortion was made difficult for persons. Difficult situation in hard. Fortunately, there are groups of abortion self-help that practice solidarity outside or independent of the state. But when the recent ruling of the Constitutional Court was published, it affected women not only in a symbolic dimension. The ban on abortion for embryo pathology. Over a dozen women were waiting in Polish hospitals for what had been a legal procedure, and they were turned away. To have the abortion involved a lot of stress and a lot of efforts. It was a race against the clock and also required money because abortion costs money. So I can't say that the state can't affect my rights. The state has institutions that can allow me to enjoy my rights. For instance, the right to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. Unfortunately, it often criminalizes people who can help me invoke these rights, forcing me to do this abroad. This leads to international solidarity. As activists, we're trying to defend what remains of the welfare state against capitalism. This often leads to real, genuine relief and aid for individuals, but it seems to me that in the present situation, the state is not enough and the state institutions are insufficient. Thank you. And now let's have Janka Świerżewska, who's a social activist, an environmental activist, and a climate activist. Good evening. I also wanted to begin by saying that a lot has been said already. A lot of examples have been given, but I wanted to begin by quoting something all of us know. When the state does not protect us, I will stand up for my sisters. And that's a very interesting slogan quote, because on the one hand, it shows that we realize the state does not protect us. There is no top-down protection. We have to look after ourselves. On the other hand, it does mention the state, so it does express some kind of hope, belief, or possibly expectation that the state might protect us. Because otherwise we would say, the state does not protect us, I will look after my sister. But the assumption that the state might protect us at some point. I, however, believe that we can't count on the state. And referring to last week's debate about grassroots solidarity and all the examples of mutual reciprocal help we gave then when institutions fail to do so. So we are taking over, we're reaching out, we're giving people helping hands. We want to look after one another. For me, this grassroots solidarity is a way of, can lead to utopian thinking. Since I'm the second to last speaker, I wanted us to think about utopian thinking. The question, do we act within the state or against the state? These are valid and good questions. I'm glad that we're discussing them in public. But the next question is, what do we want and how do we picture a new reality? We can obviously say that we want to live within the confines of the state, so we have to change the state to bring it in line with our expectations, or change the law so that the state protects us better or gives us greater protection. Perhaps this is a time when we can think what we might have instead of the state, or what could follow the state. I agree with Justina, who said that struggle is very important. We have to fight, we fight for our rights, but we have to remember those people who do not have the instruments, who don't have how to fight, whose voice can't be heard. They're single mothers who cannot go out and protest, who can't go out into the streets. So we have to take into account, we have to remember various groups and various people, but assuming that the state has failed us and we're very pissed off at the state, the Polish state or states in general, neighboring states or other states that are still at war, that don't care about citizens, about the people who live there. I'd like us to start thinking what we might have instead, or what could come next. I don't think that social movements only want to rearrange politics and the economy. They want to change the narrative. And here I'm inspired by the possibility of creating a community and consider how these various needs build, how we can give one another a sense of safety, food, or speaking of the climate, we have to realize that things that are not, that we take for granted, like food and housing, might become something we don't take for granted. So now is the time to build smaller communities, watch them grow, see what problems there are, how these grassroots initiatives work, so that there's not so much pressure, not so much a hope that the state and the law will provide safety and security. We have to start giving this to one another, and don't and instead of expecting someone to do it for us.
Okej. Dziękuję, Janka.
Thank you very much, Janka. And our last
Chciałabym poprosić
speaker in this debate
Amel jest
will be Amel Manna, who is a feminist, an anti-fascist, a social activist. She's also associated with the Syrena Collective and the Student Anti-Fascist Committee. Thanks for introducing me, and frankly, I have to say that I don't have any established views on this issue. I have a number of doubts. The idea for this debate came up when we were thinking what discussions should be about. We started talking about this as a secondary issue. And when we started talking about it, we realized that here was a topic that deserved a separate meeting. And in my contribution, I will be sharing some doubts with you. I'm glad that Zuzanna mentioned the school for me, and sorry to speak on a personal note. My experience in school has me challenged has doubts. I have doubts related to rights, even on paper. When I was a student in school, awareness, knowing that I had rights, made me a rebel, and it shaped my political development. I was a pain in the neck for my teachers, but knowing that I have rights and claiming those rights allowed me to challenge, subvert the relations of domination and power, and get some more freedom in the oppressive school system. So the funny thing was when I turned 18, and when they said I couldn't leave school and didn't give a reason, I called the police, saying I was being unlawfully held. Or when the principal took my cigarettes, I reported a theft. And this is a fond memory today, but knowing that I have rights was, for me at the time, helped me rebel when I didn't have a community to fall back on, when I didn't have specific political views. It allowed me to see myself in the world, and also helped me see how absurd many laws and regulations and bylaws are, and see how much of our life is actually subject to the law. So now that we're talking, do we act within the state or against the state, or within the law or against the law? We assume that these are the only alternatives we have, but I think that this dichotomy is part of the rationale, the nature of state and law, and testifies to their hegemony. We know that the law doesn't protect us all equally and can often lead to repression. We should remember that various parts of life aren't regulated to the same extent. The law regulates women's sexuality and reproductive rights more than it does the sexuality of men. It gives CEOs more freedom than employees, and landlords more freedom than tenants. I think we have two fronts here. We're looking at two fronts. How can we conduct a social struggle within the bounds of the law and the state, and to reinforce social rights? On the one hand, this is activity that serves to limit the freedom of privileged groups, for instance, 0 hours contracts or evictions or emptiers of buildings, and also the struggle to introduce a new definition of rape in the criminal code. On the other hand, we have action that serves to break the restrictions that apply to us, an unprivileged group, although I realize that I'm not really disadvantaged and underprivileged personally. So this is about decriminalization of our life, especially areas like abortion, sex work, migration, anti-contraception, and so on. And I personally believe that both these strategies of acting with respect to the law are necessary, but we don't pay enough attention to the second strategy, although fortunately this is changing. I said fortunately because often the main guarantee, safeguard of our rights is when they are taken beyond the bounds of legislation. I think it's risky to believe that the law is a neutral instrument that's auxiliary with respect to those who make the law. The law, apart from being a form of exercising power, is also a power and authority, one that goes beyond the courtroom. And when we forget about this, we allow the power to grow in an unfettered way. We take in certain standards, we consider them to be morally and politically neutral, and we let them shape the way we think about ourselves, the social relations, and the world. And then, even though we often don't realize it, we become an instrument of the law and not the other way around. Let's take the expectation that social struggle will be carried out within the bounds of the law, even if it's a greater risk to participants and it's less effective or it exposes them to greater repression. The bounds of the law often try to demarcate the bounds of our solidarity so that we serve the law instead of ourselves. Sometimes this is successful, but I feel that this is happening less often. This is also rooted in the belief that the law is a value unto itself, regardless of its content and how it's enforced. So instead of thinking whether action is legal or not, we have to think whether it's right. And it's a mistake to believe that's what's right and just is legal and the other way around. We know it's obvious, but sometimes we confuse these categories, or these categories are conflated, and our life and our activity is subject to the law instead of our interests, our needs, or our desires. That's why we so often seek to legitimize our life, to validate our life and experience by expressing it in legal terms instead of going beyond that. And we deprive ourselves of power over these areas of life, and we hand that power over to an authority that makes the law and enforces the law. Police, prosecutors, judges, border guards, who check whether we aren't abusing rights, breaking the law, whether we're not going beyond the narrow confines defined for us by the legislator. This is a toxic distinction into legal and illegal, and it's a way of divide and conquer, because there are always people who don't fit within this framework. For me, it's a story about who's to have power over our life. Do we want a world where we decide for ourselves, where we trust our own decisions, or do we trust the state and the law enforcement or the repressive apparatus? For me, the answer is simple. I prefer to trust social entities, groups, rather than the state, because this might not always be justified or owing to the way various functions people have, and people are embroiled in various social roles, but it's the most practical and it's worked for me so far. And a lot of people I know also agree with me personally. And I think that this helps us build firmer, more lasting alliances, even despite differences. For instance, opposing the stricter abortion law often polarizes groups within the women's movement when it's a question of which week, up until which week, 12 or 20, can abortion be done. And this polarizes us and leads to division. So I think we should aim to decriminalize abortion so that persons helping with abortion and the doctors not be penalized. I think that this can be a platform to build a broader coalition, accepting the differences instead of adopting a legalist approach. So to answer the question, community and subjectivity of citizens within the bounds or against the state, I'd say neither. These aren't the only options we have, and that's why when we try to think about subjectivity beyond the bounds of the law, state, and citizenship, we should think of a subjectivity that can be beyond, outside of citizenship, this category, because only then can it be genuine, universal, inclusive, and serve us, and not the law. We will be having a debate on March 27th, and you're all invited to watch that debate. We'll have the opportunity to see other perspectives and look at it from another angle. Thank you very much. This was the last contribution we had today. A introductory debate. This kind of debate assumes that everybody will make deliver a single statement. A discussion among you would have been fascinating, but this is the format we chose. Thank you very much, and take a look at our website. We've given the agenda, the program of this year's forum. I want to thank everybody who's given us their time and who's shared their thoughts with us. I hope to see you at the Forum for the Future of Culture online on March 26, 27, and 28. Thank you all very much.